So, I guess this is happening. WRX 90 WS EVO, finally, April 17th. It's really the retail availability of WRX 90. Meanwhile, Dell and Lenovo and HP have been cranking out WRX 90 systems. Asus was pretty early with their WRX 90 option, but this is the video where we evaluate the WRX 90 WS EVO with a retail Threadripper Pro. This is a board that promises 7 PCIe Gen 5 X16 slots, at least physically. You got 4 SATA 3, 1 blazing M.2 PCIe Gen 5, 1 Hyper M.2, that's Gen 4, 2 mini Cool Edge I.O. connectors that are Gen 4, and 2 Slim SAS connections, both at PCI Express Gen 4, one of them optionally 4 SATA lanes. At the rear I.O., we've got 2 USB 4 Type-C. USB Type 4, is that PCIe tunneling, aka Thunderbolt compatible? Yes, indeed, it is Thunderbolt compatible. Can't call it Thunderbolt, but you can plug Thunderbolt accessories into it. We've got 1 USB 3.2 Gen 2 by 2 for the Type-C on the front panel case, so that's a double-sided connector. We've got 4 USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type A at the rear. We have 4 USB 3.2 Gen 1, 2 at the rear, 2 at the front, and 4 USB 2.0 for front panel connections or accessory headers, basically is what they've become. The rear I.O. features a DisplayPort-in connection for a USB 4 solution, so you can go from your graphics card back into a graphics card. We've also got dual 10 gigabit Ethernet thanks to our Intel X710 Ethernet adapter. Now, the Intel X710, it's going to need some firmware updates. But that's cool, because you always update the BIOS and all the drivers and everything when you first get a machine, right? Yep. Okay, cool. This motherboard does feature an ASpeed AST2600 baseband management controller, so you'll be able to remote into this machine and do whatever you want. It's an EEB motherboard, which means it's 12 by 13 inches or 30.5 by 33.0 centimeters. And finally, it's Nahimic audio with a true Realtek ALC1220 audio solution. The motherboard is implemented with 18+3+3 power phases in a 14-layer PCB. It's a bit no frills, though. There's no rear metal cover. Mostly what features on the board are redrivers. We've got these redrivers and retimers on the rear here. There's a ton of them on the front. Those help with PCIe signal integrity when we're talking about the insane speeds of PCI Express Gen 5. You'll also note there is one rubber pad on the back here. This is for people that don't pay attention to the standoffs for the motherboard. There's a standoff that's normally here in an ATX case. You want to unscrew that standoff from your case and configure it for the specific SSI EEB layout that you see on this board. Did you notice it has 5 fans for the VRM? It looks like a relatively modest VRM solution, especially when you compare this to, Asus is insanely overbuilt. Nevertheless, this solution delivers over 1,000 watts to your WRX 90 Threadripper Pro processor, which is all you really want to responsibly put into that processor anyway. Does this platform work for the 96-core CPU? Why, yes, it would. Another slightly unusual feature of this motherboard is that it has the SATA general purpose I.O. headers. This is useful for communicating with a SATA backplane. I have a feeling this is a feature borrowed from ASRock rack. It's nice to see that on a board like this. This motherboard also has an RGB header. It's the only WRX 90 motherboard with RGB capabilities built right in. At the bottom edge of the board, you also have your baseband management controller interfaces. This can be useful for things like a managed power supply and a rack mount case. You also get your VGA header. So if you do need to use external VGA, you're just going to load this thing down with storage or networking cards or other peripherals. It does have onboard VGA as part of that remote management baseband management controller. The bottom edge of the board also features 2 analog temperature sensor inputs, so you can strap temperature sensors to whatever you want to monitor the temperature and see that in the baseband management controller. You could use it for air intake monitoring or specific peripheral monitoring. It's a pretty handy feature, really. At the bottom edge of the motherboard, we do have a right angle USB 2.0 connector as well as a right angle front panel audio. So if you did want to use a GPU that's going to hang off the end of the board, I think you're going to be okay. It might have been nice to see the fan connector and some other connectors here at a right angle, but I don't think it'll bother us too much if we have a fan plugged in somewhere else other than the bottom of the motherboard if you do have a large GPU hanging off the end of the motherboard. If you look closely on the board, you'll see that it has a sticker on it labeled 3.2. That suggests that there are plucky, hardworking hardware engineers that have poured their life and soul into this motherboard in order to resolve bugs and issues with the platform. And for that, I am greatly appreciative because I am sure Sure, the boards before 3.2 had massive problems. ASUS. Massive. See also my earlier Threadripper WRX 90 launch video. Sometimes it's handy when you just buy a machine that's pre-built, like our Falcon Northwest system, basically trouble-free because they figured out all the issues, and it's like we're gonna make sure that you don't hit any of these landmines because you bought from a Falcon Northwest system. I get why, but anyway, let's put it together. Now this board is comically large, and we know from our other videos the DDR5 needs a lot of airflow over it. DDR5 registered error correcting DDR5 can silently throttle much past about 65 degrees C. So you just leave performance on the table. And if you're buying this much hardware at this price point, you don't want to leave a scrap of performance on the table. That's madness. This is the Torrent Compact. Is this the smallest case that can contain the awesomeness? It's pretty tiny. It's tiny, but it's got one thing that we need in droves, and that is massive airflow. If this case is a little too small, I suggest that you check out the Fractal North XL. It is XL enough for this. It is excellent as a case, in fact. All right, Fractal, all we need is 5 more millimeters, just 5 more millimeters. I'm not going to do this, but it was useful for checking. You could make it work if you were really determined, but I don't really want to give up any of my front connections that are at a right angle. If I ran a lot of GPUs off of this board too, I would have a problem because the 6-pin auxiliary power input for the motherboard. And this is important if you're running a lot of high power usage PCIe peripherals, because the PCIe slot can supply up to 75 watts per peripheral, but there's not that many 12-volt connections going into the motherboard. It becomes a math problem, power delivery problem. So having that extra 6-pin connector there gives you 3 more 12-volt lines, which can each deliver, 75 watts, plus the 2 and the 24-pin connector, plus maybe, well, probably not actually on the CPU connector. So you could drive a few more 75-watt connections, but in terms of like 7 GPUs, I don't know about that. Now there's a 6-pin connection at the front edge here. That's just for PCIe peripherals, but you might notice that we've got 7 and 7 connections at the top. This can run in a dual power supply configuration. There's a little adapter pigtail in the box that makes it so that you don't have to plug in 2 24-pin connections. You have to plug in one 24-pin connection, and then there's this little adapter that plugs into the motherboard that controls the other power supply. Ideally, they're matched balanced power supplies, but they should be matched balanced power supplies, like 2,000 watt power supplies, or probably not less than 2 850 watt power supplies. Like, don't even bother if you're gonna like 2 700 watt power supplies. Just no, don't do that. That's 2,000 watt power supplies, 2 1,200 watt power supplies. You're gonna overclock, you deliver a lot of power, and you're gonna want to connect all these connections: the CPU style 8-pin, the GPU style 6-pin, connect it all. In principle, I love the idea of cramming this giant motherboard in this tiny little case. Like, there's just something cute about that. It's like, look at my cute little Threadripper system. But I don't want to lose access to those ports. So I'm going to have to go with my own advice, get a Fractal North XL. It's so massively expensive. Let's get that Micro Center sticker on it. All right, so this is what we ended up with, the Fractal North XL Tempered Glass Edition. We're not dealing with something that's right up against a fan, but it turned out pretty good. For the build, I'm using a 1,200 watt power supply with the Arctic 4UM tower cooler. It's a 24-core Threadripper Pro in there right now. If it was a 32-core or a 64-core or even the 96-core, I would probably opt for something that has a little bit more cooling capacity. Fractal also sells the Dynamic X2 GP18 PWM. These are enormous 180mm fans. I put 2 in the top as intake. So all the fans, front and top, are intake, and it exhausts out the rear. And boy, the airflow, it's something. For the memory, I'm using Kingston JetX Standard DDR5 5600. This runs at DDR5 5200 by default because that's the fastest speed officially supported by AMD. 52, not 56. You can tighten up the timings a little bit, but it's probably not necessary because it's nearly 200 gigabytes per second in AIDA64. And yeah, AIDA64 is a benchmarking, like that's a whole other dimension. But it's not a bad configuration. Now, when you're running 8 DIMMs on this motherboard, ASRock does not give you the option to enable S3 suspend to RAM. And the reason for that is because suspend to RAM normally uses standby power from the power supply. And it's going to take a lot of power to deliver that standby current. Most power supplies, except for the very newest ones, can't really deliver that level of standby power. So it's a bit of a problem. Asus, for their version of the WRX 90 motherboard, does give you a BIOS override. I could not find a BIOS override like that on the ASRock side. But if you do run 2 or 4 DIMMs with this motherboard, then you can get S3. But if you're going to run 4 DIMMs, you're better off just getting TRX 50 and the non-pro version of the CPU, unless you need the 96-core version of the CPU, in which case your use cases are smaller, in my opinion. I think that 32-core CPU and the hypothetical 48-core CPU are much more reasonable sweet spots for this platform. Find myself also, like, in the past, like, oh yeah, 24 cores is good because you get a really high boost clock and everything else works really well with the boost. But I think for 7000 series Threadripper, the sweet spot is actually 32 cores, which, you know, stings a little bit because the 32 core price jump from 24 cores is not insignificant. 24 cores is, of course, 4 6-core CCDs. The 32 cores is 4 8-core CCDs. So you do get the benefit of, you know, full 8 memory channels of bandwidth. For the GPU, I've chosen the Taichi 7900 XTX because that'll let me run some machine learning experiments and everything else. And for the SSD, it's the Phison Maximum 14 gigabyte per second SSD. Runs very fast. This is a motherboard that requires both 8-pin connections for CPU power. It optionally has 2 6-pin PCIe style power connections. ASRock recommends that you install both of those for overclocking. I would recommend that you connect at least one. And this has to do more with the power delivery circuit, boost clocks, and precision boost overdrive, should you elect to use precision boost overdrive. But even if you don't, it can lend some stability to the system. There's also 2 6-pin connections at the bottom front edge of the motherboard. You really only have to connect one of those unless you're running a really heavily loaded GPU configuration. So if you did try to run this in a much smaller system that didn't really support the EEB motherboard form factor, as we were doing earlier in this video, you're okay only connecting the one because the other one is blocked because the front of the case is with the front edge of the motherboard. But I've connected both because why not? This motherboard also has dual MCIO and dual slim SAS. If level 1 is good for nothing else, it is good for wasting tons and tons of money on all kinds of connections. We've got our dual mini cool edge to U.2. We've got our, slim SAS to U.2. We've got our breakout from slim SAS to SATA, because some of the connections here support SATA, including our monitoring header, which is for, of course, your backplane, and a reverse breakout cable, which is for some of our IC dock enclosures. This would be a particularly good motherboard to use with some of the IC dock accessories that we've reviewed in the past. Basically, you run a cable from this to your IC dock, and then you've got hot swap bays for 2.5-inch SATA, for U.2, U.3, if you're looking to add U.3 to this platform. The BIOS has options for configuring these ports in terms of SATA or PCIe. It does not auto-detect, so you'll have to explore the BIOS for those options. The mini cool edge connections will run at PCIe Gen 5. We tested that with our Kioxia CM7 as we did on our ASRock TRX 50 platform, but this, the WRX 90, has double the connections. So you can run 4 U.2 right off the board, 2 Gen 4 and 2 Gen 5. It's pretty impressive. One thing I really want to drive home is ASRock has really overbuilt the PCIe delivery capabilities on this motherboard. There are tons of redrivers and retimers on the top and bottom of the motherboard, on the front and the back, ever how you want to say that, which means that your PCIe slot signal integrity should be second to none. And moving our M.2 around the board, yeah, that seemed to work really well. If you're going to run a lot of M.2, you're going to need an add-in card to drive more M.2 devices. There's only 2 M.2 on board. There's no secondary M.2 or tertiary M.2 for like a wireless card or something like that. So if you wanted to add wireless, you're probably best off doing that via USB. Physically, you have 7 X16 slots, but one of them is X8, PCIe 5, I believe. Slot 6 is 8 lanes. So if you have a dual slot graphics card, slot PCIe 5 might be a good choice, because then you only block 8 lanes and that leaves a lot of other PCIe slots free. It is kind of wild that the VRM solution here has 5 fans. Actually, I'm sort of alarmed at the number of fans in this system altogether. 1 in the power supply, 3 in the front, 2 in the top, 2 on the CPU cooler, 3 on the CPU fan, 5 on the motherboard. That is a lot of fans. That's fantastic. Fancy? No, it's alarming is what it is. And there's a fan on the M.2. I forgot about that one. You don't need the fan on the M.2. Like, there's enough airflow in this configuration that passive cooling on that Phison Maximum is totally okay. I just don't want to keep taking it apart, putting it together, taking it apart, and putting it together, and take the chance on ruining it. With this system put together, what do you get over the TRX 50 version of this build that has 4 memory channels instead of 8? Well, for one, you've got the ASMedia PCIe tunneling controller on the back with DisplayPort in. So this is, Thunderbolt capable. You can plug your Thunderbolt peripherals into this, even though this is not an Intel Thunderbolt controller. Thunderbolt compatible. But it works. It works with our Cooler Master external. It works with our external Cooler Master GPU. You just plug that in and you're good to go. And our dual 10 gigabit Intel X710 also works really well. All in all, this platform is pretty put together and pretty polished. That 3.2 on the motherboard, that was the BIOS version this thing shipped with. But ASRock has actually published 4 BIOS updates since this board was initially available in at least the non-US markets. I guess this was available overseas a little sooner than it was available in America. So we've moved from version 3 to 4 and beyond, and that's really great to see. ASRock is definitely ahead right now in terms of the number of BIOS updates and the number of BIOS features added since the launch of the board. It's always nice to see. I always get a little alarmed when you're not getting at least, frequent beta BIOS updates or versions of the BIOS that fix bugs or solve issues. Now, what about power delivery and overclocking and all that? Well, I did run the 24 and the 96 core CPU up to 1200 watts. I think this motherboard is perfectly fine for PBO and, that's something in that 1000-watt range. With PBO and the curve optimizer, this 24-core CPU will run all day long at 400 watts. Curiously, putting the 24-core Threadripper Pro versus the 24-core Threadripper in Cinebench R23 and R24, Cinebench R23 is much more of a power virus than Cinebench R24. I actually thought something was wrong with the system at first, because running Cinebench R24, no matter what I did, it seemed like the CPU power usage was capped at about 300 watts, whereas on Cinebench R23, I didn't look at until later because I'm apparently an idiot, was 370 watts. And this is a 350 watt CPU in the normal configuration. 370 watts, I'll take it. Enabling PBO and curve optimizer and running through, all of the other settings, then this CPU could use north of 400 watts on this cooler for short stints. The Arctic cooler seems to get soaked for heat at around 380 watts, give or take. Probably doing a little better than average just because of the ridiculous volume of airflow through this system. And also DDR5 is a bit of a concern because most DDR5 registered error correcting will start to silently throttle much past 65 degrees C. In this configuration, the RAM gets plenty of airflow and it does not throttle. This is a 512 gigabyte configuration with 64 gigabyte DIMMs. That is fantastic. You don't always get that. You have to be on top of that. You can use Hardware Info 64 to monitor that. And I was pleased to see that the individual voltage controllers for CPU power delivery were all available in Hardware Info 64, so you can monitor board temperatures there directly using the telemetry from the VRM. Now, of course, the IPMI also has power and voltage telemetry, which you can monitor, but because it's through the IPMI, you're not going to be able to get more frequent updates than once every 3 or 4 seconds. Well, once every a second or two at most. Otherwise, it's going to report 0 and be a little weird. We've seen that from ASpeed in general. It's not a board thing. It's an ASpeed IPMI thing. But something to keep in mind when you're looking at the particulars of this system. Back to my story about 24-core versus 24-core. So 24-core Threadripper would boost on all cores during the Cinebench runs to 4.8. Threadripper Pro would boost to 4750. So slightly slower on the Threadripper Pro. For the single core boost, we were seeing like 5.3, 5.4 gigahertz, very similar to what we were getting on our Threadripper non-Pro. 4 memory channels versus 8 memory channels. More memory channels is more better, especially if you're doing things like Unreal Engine compiles and that sort of thing. Although it is counterintuitive. I'm working on another separate video specifically for Unreal Engine and compile workloads that's going to be more of a head-to-head between 24 cores versus 24 cores. We're also going to take our 96 core for a spin in a couple of different configurations in 4 and 8 memory channels. I've been chasing a couple of weird things with Unreal Engine and Threadripper Pro and everything else. It's been a little bit of a challenge just because of hardware availability and workstation stuff and some other things there. TPM stuttering might be a thing, again, maybe, for some of those compile time workloads on the Windows operating system. I don't know, something I'm still investigating. In terms of motherboard review, I'm satisfied. The motherboard ticks all the boxes. It does have overclocking capabilities. If you're not going to run overclocking, then you can get the VRM fans to stop entirely, at least some of them. But if you're going to overclock, or you're going to do PBO, or you're in a system where it doesn't have adequate airflow or some other situation like that, you're going to want to let them run. But yeah, ASRock's put together something special, at least so far. And I'm happy with my North XL build. That's it for now. I'm Wendell, Level 1. I'm signing out. You can find me in the Level 1 forums.